thank you. That was really, really interesting, and I guess feels like a super thorough and very very cared for kind of narrative. And what I'm going to show you maybe is a little bit more improvised. So didn't intend it to be as improvised as it has turned out without the video. But this is Assemble. So we are a collective of 15 at the moment, and this is a picture of us building a new building outside our studio, which is in this like rumble down industrial shed here. And we took this picture because before, when we were doing competitions or trying to present ourselves, we were really regularly using this very old picture of an Amish barn raising as the closest thing that we could think of to describe our working method. We decided, after maybe 4 years of regularly using that, it was getting a bit weird, and we decided to take our own. What I thought I would do is it working? No.
It was this one?
In Spain, digging, but it doesn't matter. I've kind of leapt over it. What I thought I would do is give quite a dense introduction to Assemble, to where we've come from, how we started working together, and show you a few projects, and then talk a bit about what we've learned about collective work and cooperative working through working with children specifically, and then at the end move on and show you a little bit how some of that learning has started to inform our work in more kind of urban and architectural contexts. So we'll end up by coming back to Granby and to Liverpool. So this is the first project that we did together. It was called the Cineroleum, and this was at a point when most of us were working in architectural offices and were really frustrated and quite bored and behind MicroStation, detailing toilets, doing door schedules, and there was a sense of collective frustration, and I guess the movement to start working together and working outside the office was part naivety, part optimism, part frustration, and part, I guess, a kind of desire to pull a little bit at what our role in the world was, what we were doing. And I think possibly most important of all, a desire to have a studio culture again, so to work together, from suddenly finding everyone being very atomised behind different desks and different offices and working in teams that are quite isolated. So this project was pure improvisation. We had about £6,000, and it's all industrial materials that are treated decoratively and made by hand. Like the sign is white painted MDF that's been cut with a jigsaw and uplit with some garden lights. And the festoon curtain is hand sewn Tyvek, so roofing underlay, put on big festoons that run up and down. And this project was done entirely informally, so we didn't have a collective identity, we didn't have a collective name, we had no clear sense of the boundaries of our work either. It was done in holiday time, at weekends, after school, after work, and was the product, I guess, of a lot of experimentation. So some of it was really successful, like this is using Formica to make marquetry. Some of it was a total failure, like our homemade vacuum former in the middle. Didn't do anything apart from asphyxiate the person that was trying to do it. And then these homemade cinema chairs, so made out of scaffolding boards. And there we are, sewing the curtain. So it was really a kind of secondary education for us. It was a self-led kind of education, but one that was really, really powerful, and I guess through which we began to form a collective identity and a sense of our collective power. And so the next year, we immediately embarked on another project on a similar scale with a similar ambition, but this time thinking a little bit more about the relationship between design and the mode of production, and how design could, the way that we designed the building, the project could best enable that kind of collective sense of shared endeavour. So it's a scaffolding frame and then individually cut timber bricks that are threaded together. Like this, so it took maybe 300 people to build and required very, very little skill. So it was a almost completely flat construction site, so there was very little hierarchy, probably quite dangerous looking back on it. But it created this slightly kind of fantastical thing which looked a little bit like something a child might build. which sat under the motorway and hosted screenings and cafes and band performances and things. And the thing that I think was really interesting about that was it wasn't just about building and making architecture, but it was about becoming our own clients, so finding sites, finding money, finding materials, and then running the projects as well. So occupying them, working behind the bar, working behind the cafe, running the budgets, and then all the way through to taking them down at the end. And they were super improvised and super temporary because that was the only means that we had to work with. And I think through those projects we started to formalize a working method and then start trying to deliver projects, I guess, using what felt like joyful and useful about working together, but working with other groups of people. So this is a theatre we built with a youth theatre in Chichester. Similar principle, a big portal frame. And then the interesting thing happens when we start then trying to integrate what had been a side project, I guess a project which existed outside the logic of the market and the architecture profession, and we tried to take the same people and the same working methods and move into a more conventional conditioning context. So this is a picture of the first formal site that we worked on, the first commission project, and it's the town square at the heart of a failed garden village. I mean, failed's quite a difficult, it's quite a heavy word to use about an entire suburb, but it was a place that was famous for all the wrong reasons. And this square, which had been kind of envisaged as the market heart, was really dead and was used only as car parking, a really low quality public realm. So our idea, I guess, super enthusiastic, was to take the tool that had felt like it had been the most useful, the most evident one, which was hand making and shared construction, and use that to try and create a wider collective process that could involve the residents of the town, people that lived and worked in the area, in trying to imagine what the square might become and how it might be useful to the quality of their day-to-day life. So we built all of these enormous one-to-one prototypes of a huge range of design propositions, from a stage to host outdoor events, through to skate ramps and soft play to enable children and families to use the square more. And then hosted this series of kind of fantastical events where we went and flyed all of the shops and houses and got all of the different community groups to come and do what they normally do, but do it outside in the square for a week. And then the prototypes that were successful, that we felt like worked, we then built permanently. And this is a picture of it when it's just been completed. And it looks kind of amazing, the difference between how it was before through relatively slender means. But I guess the thing which is really interesting here, particularly in the context of thinking about cooperative action and collective work and its relationship to the urban and to architecture, was that when we removed ourselves from this situation, a lot of this quite exciting, beautiful public life also disappeared, because whilst we had managed to build a community through the process of the project, through the prototyping, through the construction methods, we hadn't accounted for our critical role in sustaining and motivating and as part of the infrastructure that enabled that community. So the square is still used occasionally, and it's certainly much nicer than it was before, but I guess that started a process for us of thinking about what kind of environment, what kind of infrastructure you need to create the kinds of processes that we'd enjoyed running our own clients, running our own projects, being our own clients in for a broader group of people in the wider city. I think, so this is Peter Carl, who taught quite a few of us. And I think one of the most interesting things, one of the most useful thought process that we started, was trying to understand what really made up a space, or made up a way of using a space, and tried to expand, I guess, our sense of our action beyond people that created physical space, to try and understand the city or understand the spaces we were working with more as processes, I guess, as more complex things. And that in trying to act on them, you had all sorts of different tools and timescales. And that one of the problems, I guess, with the traditional architecture commissioning process for the kind of outcome we were interested in was that the architect's only present for a very small part of the process. You come in the room once the brief is written, and then you generally leave once you've finished snagging the work at the end. And that kind of encapsulated, I guess, what had been problematic with that project I showed you in the garden village. Even though we'd tried to expand the space in that traditional model as much as possible, we'd still met its really hard limits in terms of sustaining a longer term collective life in the town. And this, I guess, also started a process of thinking about what culture is and how culture is sustained and where it comes from. And a process, I guess, of introspection in terms of thinking about how our working method was sustained. And so we work with no internal hierarchy. We work in shifting project teams, and we work with self-managed budgets. So it kind of works a bit like a cloud computer. And it's very interesting then to try and understand how, even though we took that collective working method into our project, how difficult it was to recreate that for other people, to recreate a social infrastructure that would enable a collective working method that could produce a project. And so when we started working on this project, which is I guess was commissioned as an art project actually in East Glasgow, so it's the biggest city in Scotland, the east end of which is one of the densest areas of poverty in Europe. And we were commissioned to deliver an art project there. And it was an area that was undergoing massive and sustained regeneration, but in a way that I guess in the short term felt quite violent. So the quality of the public realm remained extremely poor, the quality of the housing remained extremely poor, and for the kind of 2 to 5 year horizon, the main effect of the regeneration was that there were hoardings everywhere, and there was very little benefit, I guess, to anyone that was living there. And that makes sense to us. That kind of makes sense. It makes sense in the mind of an adult, but it makes no sense at all in the mind of a child. You know, a child doesn't understand or think on a timescale that can make sense of a 5 or a 10-year program. So our idea here was to start working with the children. So we found this site, which had been a playground that had been abandoned since the 1970s. And it's just on the southern edge of a quite big housing estate that houses about 2,500 people. They'd left as kind of an island, so all around it there was a big motorway put on its western side, so separating it from the city, big industrial estate that's being demolished directly to the south, and then 3 sets of streets on the west side which had been demolished to make way for an athletes' village, during which process the community had lost all their shops, the community centre, doctor's surgery and things. And so what we started trying to do was to think about how we could use this site and create a culture, create the infrastructure or nurture a culture on this site that would enable the children of the area to start to make change for themselves, to build an environment that suited their needs in the short term, in the really immediate sense, rather than the kind of long term scared of regeneration. And so we started working in this very incremental way, first breaking up the tarmac, and then taking out the demolition rubble from under the tarmac, putting down wood chip, and then just bringing on really, really minimal infrastructure that just kind of signposted that it was available for children and gave them some kind of infrastructure to use. So tunnels and netting. Started a fire, and then gradually over the first few weeks on site, bringing on more and more parts, more and more things that made the environment increasingly plastic, and working in a way that we tried to create as much freedom around the children as possible, give them as much of a sense of their own agency, their own right to use the space and to change it how they wanted to. And this is when a load of topsoil for planting got delivered, and you know, it's kind of like the epitome of a plastic environment, mud, right? It's just like totally malleable. And then over the preceding year, gradually evolving the site, bringing on more things, introducing tools, working with local youth workers who worked with the children and I guess created a sense of possibility, showed them how to do stuff, gave them a sense of what would be possible. So starting to cook on site. And this is like I guess an ongoing process of improvisation that has this kind of magpie thing, you know. So children start going out into the city and getting things that they want and bringing them back. And I think that really echoed the process that we'd undergone in our first two projects, you know, this thing of getting hold of a site and then realising that together we could do something with it, and then gradually becoming braver and braver and magpieing, finding things, experimenting with construction, experimenting with making form. And throughout this process, a lot of our emphasis was actually on the adults that we were working with who were looking after the site day to day, and on, this is one of them, Alan, putting up a swing, and also on the individual development of the children, so thinking about them quite individually actually, and thinking about trying to understand where they'd come from, what their life experience had been, what kind of support they needed, and what we could put in place to make their use of the site as meaningful as possible. And the videos I wanted to show you, which I'll see if I can make work, I guess I'll start by showing you, let's see.
It's already on, huh?
Ah, okay. Oops, that's the wrong one.
Yeah,
okay.
Okay. Yeah, it's working.
So I guess I wanted to use the videos to talk a little bit about, I guess, what we learned from children, or learned by working with children, about collective work. And so over time, I guess our emphasis on this project gradually shifted away from thinking about the children as individuals and trying to understand how you could enable them to make their own community, where they determined the rules of how they related to each other, where they determined what happened on site down to the level of what staff were employed, what they ate, how money was spent. And actually only in the same way that for us, only by working together had we discovered that we actually had the capacity to make change and to create our own employment. That the same was probably true for the children. And in our own practice, I guess we have had and we still have this, I guess, kind of ongoing tension, which I guess posits collective possibility as, I guess, the foundation, the reason that we continue to work together, but that has some kind of ongoing and constant conflict with individual identity, with individual agency, and your capacity to do things in your own name, or do things that other people don't agree with, or have different political opinions, and that this kind of forms a triangle in some way with meaningful freedom, like how you use collective possibility to make freedom that is meaningful, without crushing people. And I guess the thing that we learnt on this project, I'm going to show you another video now. I'll just switch quickly. I guess the thing that we learnt on that project, in some ways, was a new way to think about what it meant to say that someone has meaningful freedom to do things. And I think quite often when you think about freedom, you think about it in a relatively like negative way. It's kind of imagined, I think culturally it's quite often imagined as an absence of constraint. And I think what working with children, if you think about the difference between an environment like this and a more traditional playground with a hard slide and concrete surfaces and stuff, you can kind of start to think about freedom not so much as the absence of constraint, which you could equally have in a traditional playground on a hard concrete surface, and think instead about the provision of positive possibility. I think about freedom not as the lack of rules, but as the provision of opportunities that you can act on in a sustained way. And I think that's what designing and working in environments for children has really taught us, and in some ways that has started to resolve that problem that has kind of coursed away in our design practice, which is, I guess, a tension between what it means to work together and have power that way, and then how that relates to yourself as an individual and your own ambitions or your own capacities. The other thing which I think is quite extraordinary, so this video is taken in Hanegi Park. It's the oldest adventure playground in Japan. It's one of the only ones. It was established in the 1970s by a group of parents who commissioned a landscape architect to make a playground for their kids in the local park. And this landscape architect happened to very shortly after that go on holiday to Denmark, where they have this extraordinary adventure play culture which has survived from the Second World War, and came back to Tokyo and was like, this is what we're doing. And the other thing I think that this video and a couple of other ones which you might course through demonstrate is actually that children generally, if they're not too interrupted, cooperate quite naturally. And that quite often when we approach children, whether we think about education or we think about designing for children, there's an idea of the adult having to provide a structure within which the children make meaning. And there's an idea that maybe children are bad at concentrating and need disciplining and things. And the thing that I think quite interesting about watching children play in these very free environments is actually that with the absence of too much intervention, they find ways to collaborate very, very naturally, and that there's a kind of ongoing, a very consistent improvisation that maybe sometimes has a consistent project, has an outcome in mind, like this one, which will emerge, or in the case of the bridge that we looked at earlier, sometimes is just about testing materials and testing your body and testing your own capacity to work in the world. Let me just show you one more, which is quite interesting, I think. Maybe we can look at them both at once. So this one, I think, maybe we'll just look at this one, it's easier. So this video is actually taken in a school, and these thoughts will all connect up at the end, I hope. If not, you can ask me questions. So this is a school. This is a school in southern Spain, and it's a democratic school. So it's a school which is run cooperatively by the adults and the children, and it's a school where the children are compelled to do nothing. So there is an idea at the heart of the pedagogy here that children can be trusted. They can be trusted to decide what to do with their own time. They can be trusted to know what they need to learn, and they can be trusted to ask for help that they need. And they can be trusted, if well enough supported, to create a community within which each of them can learn what they need to learn. And this has the thing I think that this environment does really well is show that how important resources in that you have the capacity to act in quite thoroughgoing, quite transformative ways on the world around you. And you see children do things here that, like you all did, like make you completely wince, but actually, you get far fewer scraped knees than you do in a traditional playground. I might just sit back to this, because what I'm going to just try and quickly do is connect this back to, hopefully this will work, our work in Liverpool. Here we go. So I guess kind of holding those ideas about freedom and about collective action in mind, as we did when we started approaching this project, I'm going to talk to you quickly about the work in Toxteth that Cyril mentioned earlier. And so Toxteth is in North Liverpool. It was a thriving industrial area until about the 1920, and underwent a series of transformations, the most dramatic of which was, I guess, a transition from being a predominantly white working class area to gradually becoming the centre of the black British population in Liverpool. And Liverpool was a port town and had for a long time, had one of the most diverse communities in the UK. And there was a mass uprising there in the 80s, which are quite notorious because they're the only civil disturbances in kind of modern times in which the army has been called in the UK. And really they were protests about the systemic disinvestment in the area, which has kind of combined with wider policies in the UK. So this is at the time of early Thatcher's government, disembowelment of industry and shipbuilding, and it formed a kind of crucible in Toxteth, and the streets were left in this condition. And this photo was taken, so this was in 1980, I can't remember, 1982 I think, and this photo was taken last year. And so Toxteth had long been thought of as a problem area, and the response to it, which was actually led by central government, not by local government, was to basically take a tabula rasa approach, to pull people out of it, to disperse the population throughout Liverpool, and to leave the houses which had been burnt in the riots in the condition they were in. Something that's quite tragic is that not only had houses been burnt out, but also most of the high streets have been very, very badly damaged, and so there was very, very little community infrastructure there, so nowhere to go and buy milk, toilet roll. Lots of people that had businesses that, you know, were the glue that kept the community together, didn't have premises anymore. And so a lot of houses were compulsory purchased by the council. A lot of them were council tenants, and they were moved on. But there was a group of people who lived on one street which went straight through the centre of the area. It's called Cairn Street, who, for various reasons, generally because they owned their houses and they were not being offered enough money through the compulsory purchase orders to buy houses of a commensurate size, they're people with families elsewhere in Liverpool, stayed. And Toxteth went into a spiral of kind of managed decline, where there was eventually no proper waste collection, where the perimeter of the area was being policed instead of, you know, a more traditional, more integrated approach, which meant that trouble from elsewhere in the city gradually migrated into the area, and the situation became increasingly intolerable. And so really the collective action which has sparked the change in this area was born out of desperation. So there's a group of residents here who got to a point where they simply could not continue to live in the area as it was, and started taking very small, very pragmatic steps, which they couldn't really achieve on their own, just to try and make their area more tolerable to live in. And that started by clearing out the waste which had been largely fly-tipped around the back of their houses. And gradually, the effectiveness of that action crept forwards and crept onto the street, and they started repainting houses. So houses that had been tinned up for well over a decade by this point, they started painting. And I guess just trying to make the street feel more humane, less like a, you know, and then following that sort of planting. So there's a really incremental approach whereby people with vested interest gradually start to realise their own capacity to change the conditions of their day-to-day lives in relatively modest ways, but based on a shared collective interest. Oh, am I going the wrong way? I am going the wrong way, sorry. And out of this, eventually, there was then a wave of another attempt at very top-down regeneration, which would have seen the demolition of most of the houses on that, all of the houses on that street. And these residents started doing sit-in protests in houses that were about to be demolished. And out of that formed a community land trust. So really that was the sit-in protests, which were really at the acute end of need, were what enabled them to start working formally together, a response to a problem that couldn't be dealt with individually. And when we started working with them, they'd been a community land trust for a couple of years and had had very little success basically getting any traction with the council, but had developed an idea about how the area should be taken into the future, like what should be, how, you know, what the alternative to this top-down, demolish everything attitude was. And it was a very incremental approach. So the idea was that they would be able to rehabilitate their street, and then maybe a Liverpool City Council would be able to take on some other houses that are in better condition. Maybe they'd be able to get some small grants and start working on the high street and so on. And our role really, when we came in, this conversation was already happening, and our role really was just to take those ideas and present them in a way that the City Council were able to take them seriously. So like basically just lend them a kind of coherence and authority and certainty by making drawings, by articulating them in the right kind of language, and giving them the capacity to push that conversation forward. Generated this very, you know, fancy-looking book that really was a work of fiction, but started to lay out in quite a bit of detail how the different things might be occupied, how the different houses might be occupied, how they might be financed, and how the CLT could work at the centre of this. And so this was the condition of the houses when they were eventually transferred for £1 each. 10 of them were transferred to the Community Land Trust. And there was a budget of about £30,000 to £40,000 for each house. I don't know what it's under 100 anyway. Yeah, so not very much money. And this is kind of where the architectural approach was to work together in quite a detailed way with the land trust to try and understand how the existing condition of the houses could be used rather than fought against, to make maybe houses with stranger sets of shapes inside, but that made some kind of use or made an asset out of their state of dereliction. So this is a front bedroom of a traditional terraced house that would normally have a flat roof. The ceiling's fallen in, so it's been rebuilt as a pitched roof bedroom. I'll rumble forward a bit. And maybe not, yeah. So the thing that seemed interesting to us, having struggled a bit on that project in Glasgow, in terms of how much we had to be involved to sustain and maintain that collective culture on that site, was so the CLT had been born out of a moment of desperation, but had become a very robust piece of collective infrastructure. And then as the problem they were set up to deal with was resolved, as the houses in their street came back into use, one of the key questions was how could that culture be maintained? How could people that came into the street and joined them, moved into their nice new houses with their understore covered and pitched ceilings, become involved? And how could that continue to be an engine that could drive the regeneration of the area and drive the change, but at the pace and at a quality that the people that was of the best interest of the people that lived there? So this started as an experiment of using demolition rubble to walls that had fallen down inside houses, using the waste that was there as aggregate to make fireplaces, which were cast in the garden of one of the houses, and then polished in one of the empty houses, and then installed in the living room. This is it. Yeah, so this is a diagram of ours. So while we're doing this, while this process is going on, so we've taken over one of the houses in the street. So we're living in this bedroom up here. The front room's being used as a site office by the contractors that we're working with. There's a kind of community cafe running out of the kitchen, and then at that time the backyard was being used as a workshop to make these mantelpieces. And we became quite interested in the idea of making as a way to make relationships, so sustain a place that could sustain a culture of handcraft and making, being a way that people could come together and continue to have a hands-on relationship with the world around them, and that could, in its own way, become, I guess, a kind of centre or a place that could protect and nurture that culture of getting on and making do and taking matters into your own hands. So first of all, the first thing the workshop produced was a set of domestic objects which went into the houses. So they were done very, very cheaply, and they felt in some places quite anonymous. So the idea behind these objects was that they were designed in such a way that A, they were quite simple to learn how to make, but secondarily that they embraced chance and happenstance and the intrinsic qualities of the materials. So they all become, all of the objects that the workshop made are all they're all different, and they all show the trace of the hand of the maker, and I guess celebrate the many different hands and the many different skills that go into making them. And I guess through that hold some kind of trace of their origin, and they go into the houses and they invest them with some degree of love and care that's beyond what you could get with a standard builder's finish. But possibly more importantly, it meant that everyone that came and worked in the workshop from the area had a really formative impact on the things that they made, and they could take quite a lot of joy in the labour, because there's a really close connection between their hand, their decisions, and the outcome. And I think it's quite interesting in relation to some of the ideas that Raquel's exhibition raises, in that it forms a kind of middle ground, or it forms a way of kind of negotiating two of our interests, which is, I guess, function of design producing things that create a particular kind of social life, and then design from a kind of arts and crafts perspective, as in a joyful and meaningful relationship with the labour of your work. And in these objects, I guess what we've tried to do is create a ground where both ideas can coexist. And the workshop itself, by providing that, provides a continual engine where the collective life of the community can be mediated and grow. And so the last project, this is the last slide. So I guess that project has then enabled other ones. So our continued presence in the area, running that workshop, creating those handmade details, has enabled us to continue to be part of day-to-day life and start to initiate other projects. This is one of them. It's a winter garden. So there was a house on the street which was too badly damaged by fire to be brought back into use as a domestic property. So the idea is to use it to create a permanent home for that culture of gardening and food growing, which had been so transformative, and around which the CLT as a kind of hopeful thing had really formed. But also to use that to create some permanent, I guess, infrastructure, community space. And it's going to go on site next month, which is exciting. A bit nerve-wracking. And I think in both of those projects, there's this idea which is in common with the projects around play, which is about trust and giving people the means to make change for themselves, and not totally predetermining the outcome. So understanding that to have a viable collective process, you can't also have total control over the outcome. And one of the, I guess, problems that comes up in architecture of this kind quite often, if you go back to think about the projects that I showed you at the very beginning, is that they can often be quite theatrical. They can look like collective processes, but actually there's an outcome, an end in mind, which the architect has been put under a lot of pressure by their client, to create photo opportunities and things. And I think that can be quite dangerous and quite damaging to people's experience of participating in the cities that they live in. And so it's a beautiful image, but I guess the point of it is that this building is whilst we're involved in the ongoing process, it's in many ways out of our control. So there's parts of it which we're not working on. We're working on in a collaborative way. And yeah, I guess the same is true then for that wider area. I think I've probably run out of time, haven't I? I was going to show you another video, but yeah, good. No, I can show it later if there's more questions about that. We can put one on maybe while we talk. That would be quite nice. Thank you. I hope that made sense.